Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things teaching and learning with Dr. Robin Taylor and Dr. Jamie Taylor. Robin, Jamie, welcome.
Thanks very much, Dan. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you both on. Jamie, you're a returning guest. Robin, this is your first time. Let's start where we always do. Let's get to learn a little bit about you. So, Robin, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So, as briefly as possible, background in academia as a lecturer in sports coaching, and then going into sort of the assistant professor role at Dublin City University in elite performance, working on the Prof Doc and the MSc we have running there. Previously worked as an undergraduate sports coaching lecturer. PhD finished sort of 5 years ago around talent development with a specific interest in the role of siblings in supporting talented athletes. So that took me on a really interesting journey around that sort of significant other element of our development. And then sort of practice wise, very much in the world of hockey here in the UK. So a hockey coach by background, predominantly working in the talent development space, sort of along the continuum of working with sort of newly emerging talent, as they might say, into the pathway at a young age, all the way up to sort of under 18s and a little bit of sort of university stuff on occasions. So I think probably that's me.
How long have you been coaching hockey for?
Good question. What we're in now? Probably on and off 10, 11 years. As you can imagine, different sort of levels across time, depending on how much I was playing versus how much I was coaching. Probably stopped playing around COVID, actually, and then have been able to coach far more since then.
So you got a playing background. If you don't mind me asking, what level did you get to?
Sort of, I guess, National League conference level in the UK.
Wow.
So fairly, well, very competitive. I realised I was coming to the end when I was trying to chase around after university students who were sort of 6, 7 years younger than me, and that was tough enough. So yeah, sort of middle of the road, I guess, sort of at the bottom end of the national program.
Oh, you could play, and this is the Sports Psych Show, so I've got to ask you: mental side of the game, strength, an area that when you reflect back, you could have been better at.
Probably, well, could have been better at. Depends which mental side of the game. I think distraction wise, officiating was always a big issue for me. I don't know whether I had this. But I guess some of the other skills, I think probably as everyone says, the more you study it, the more you realise if only I knew that when I was younger, how it might have helped me to navigate some of those areas. But, I guess I had some ups and downs as a junior athlete, early selection at a fairly high level, and then a bit of a plateau sort of around my 15, 16-year-old, and then sort of the same sort of ups and downs going into the senior system at club level. So some things I was all right at, and others I probably really struggled with, and certainly it's still commented to this day about my inability to manage some of those things.
I definitely wish I knew what I know now as a professional golfer. I would have won a little bit more money, not much, but a little bit more. And well, look, welcome back to Dr. Jamie Taylor. Appearance number 3, Jamie.
Hey, well, look, thank you for having me back. I don't know what I'm doing to deserve it, but I appreciate it.
No, it's a pleasure and honour to have you back. Let's reintroduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
Yeah, so my background is as a coach, rugby coach. Worked at a few different places, and have spent the last 3 years or so working with Robin at Dublin City University on the performance program with a professional doctorate and an MSc. I split my time between there and coach developer for Grey Masters Performance, and I coach at what's replaced WASP's Academy as the Midlands Central Academy. So I split my time between a bit of academia, well, more than a bit of academia, quite a bit of academia, coach development, and coaching.
So you're still coaching, are you?
Yeah, absolutely. Coaching at which would be under 18 academy level.
Okay. And I believe you are striving to use your psychological skills to become as good as you can possibly be in the fighting art of jiu-jitsu.
I am, but I don't think that my athletic achievements in the fighting art of jiu-jitsu warrant any sort of recognition just at the moment.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a couple of years and see how you've gotten on. Well, look, it's really exciting to have you both on, and I'm looking forward to unpacking a paper you've both recently written on pedagogy, on teaching and learning in a sports space. As I always say with these kind of episodes, I'm a sports psychologist with a broad definition of sports psychology. You know, I think to be the best that we can be as sports psychologists, we have to, I personally believe that the more knowledge we have around teaching, learning, because this is going on every single day on the grass, on the court, on the course, in the gym, swimming pool, and so on and so forth. So I'm very passionate about utilizing the Sports Psych Show as a platform to learn more about how human beings learn and how the teaching process takes place and the relationship between teaching and learning. And with that in mind, we're here to talk today about this new paper of yours. You've written it alongside Mike Ashford, who's been on the show before, Dr. Michael Ashford, and Rosie Collins. And it essentially unpacks pedagogy, contemporary pedagogy, the use of theory in practice, and the notion of taking an evidence-informed perspective of pedagogy, teaching. Robin, you headed up this paper, so let's come to you first. Before we do a deep dive, before we get into the weeds of this paper, can you give me a sort of an introduction here, the genesis of this paper? What got you interested in discussing the wheres and the what-fors of contemporary pedagogy?
Yeah, of course. I think, well, I mean, the very initial spark came from a module we teach on our programs, where we encourage our students to dig into learning, both how they learn and how others learn. And I think what really caught my eye was this useful approach to sort of exploring different learning theories, and helping them to help us make sense of human development, and try and apply that in our domain to try and get, a little bit more, maybe a little bit more knowledge, but also just to help us explore and explain what we do in practice. So we covered a number of learning theories, but I think the cognitive psychology element really stuck with me around some of the key concepts that we discuss in this paper. And we really felt there was an opportunity to write a paper that just highlighted some of these concepts in the psychological space, in the cognitive space, and really just helped coaches to make sense of those a little bit more, and try and, push and explore what they do and why they do it, and really try and reconsider what was maybe presented as traditional in terms of a lot of the cognitive psychology aspects are seen as fairly traditional at the moment, and really trying to change maybe what we mean by contemporary, or at least provide some alternative explanations for contemporary, in the fact of how it helps the learner at any given time to explore and really look at this sort of evidence-informed approach. So that was really the sort of underpinning element that we really wanted to look at in this paper, and that's where we started, really, and to really help practitioners go, look, there's lots of ways we might do things. Here's some. Let's see what they look like, and let's unpick them a little bit practically, and let's see how they might help.
Jamie, coming to you here. I mean, obviously the paper is primarily exploring a cognitive approach to learning. We've spoken about this before on the Sports Psych Show, but we're going to unpack it here in great detail. But there are different theories of learning, isn't it? What I love what you've done in the introduction is you've unpacked those theories for the reader. But it can feel quite daunting, I guess, for coaches to think, when I deliver my sessions, I need to have a theoretical underpinning to what I'm doing here. Can you speak to that a little bit for me? Is it necessary to have a theoretical underpinning? And in terms of those different learning theories, I mean, what can a coach expect to read about when they start reading the introduction to this text?
Look, I think there's quite a lot going on there. And I think it's a really interesting area that goes, right, so does every coach need to have a single meta-theoretical framework that underpins everything they do as a coach? So do I need, as a coach, to hold a single theoretical framework that guides my practice? In my view, the answer to that depends a little bit. But in typical coaching practice, I don't think that that's necessarily valuable, and for two reasons. One, that you look across philosophy, science, anywhere you go, there are very, very few single theories that will explain absolutely everything. Even if you get into theoretical physics, nobody can agree on a single theory that explains everything. Now, what I think, what I hope is coming across in the paper that we've written is that there are lots of different bigger picture. That's what I'm saying. Meta theoretical. I mean, bigger picture theoretical frameworks that other theories fit into, and that we can use to explain the evidence that is gathered. Now, it is our view and the perspective of this paper that there is no single meta theoretical framework that can explain all of coaching practice, and that coaches need to draw on lots of different theories to inform their practice. So the introduction outlines some of those, and it also speaks to different layers. So there are the theoretical frameworks, for example, such as cognitivism. Now, whether that's a meta-theoretical framework is a slightly grey area, but we'll see it as that for the time being. And then there are specific theories, such as cognitive load theory, such as desirable difficulty, such as fidelity of practice, that we look at in the paper and go, right, well, how does a coach use these particular theories to make sense of their practice?
And there are competing meta theories versus that sort of cognitivist approach. Would I be right in saying that?
I think it very much depends on who you're reading to decide whether they are competing. And indeed, yes. So there is a typical framing that we refer to that says there are information processing, which is tied to cognitivism, but it's not fully the same thing. And for example, an ecological dynamics lens. There are two. These are seen as two very different approaches that theoretically can't necessarily be linked together. What we're suggesting, though, is that there are shades of grey in all of in lots of theories, and there are also others that sit outside this two-way dichotomy. There's lots of different things going on. For example, predictive processing would be a new one that we might discuss later on. But what we're saying is that if a coach goes, right, I am this or I am that, then it's necessarily going to limit their ability to make sense of practice, and that all theories are useful in making sense of the ways in which we practice. And I think that that's quite I suppose it's quite a controversial position in that but what we're suggesting is that as a coach, we've got to understand that knowledge is fallible, that we cannot know everything, and we need to look at things in different ways.
Coming to you, Robin, if a coach has the opportunity to look at methods related to a range of theories, so they can look at the cognitive theory, they can look at an ecological theoretical underpinning, they can look at a constructivist theoretical underpinning. In this paper, though, you've chosen to unpack coaching and methods of coaching from a cognitive point of view. Why is that? Why have you really honed in on a cognitive point of view?
Yeah, so I think there was a certain interest there from our perspective in terms of what we found interesting and the role of sort of the level of learner and the importance of prior knowledge, and how we felt that sort of is a useful thing to consider for coaches in terms of what are our learners coming into the environment with, and how important is that when we shape what we do. And I think, lots of people would agree that's a very important consideration. So these theoretical or these considerations that Jamie's outlined in terms of cognitive load, novice and expertise, desirable difficulty, fidelity, gave us an opportunity to help sort of link that prior knowledge to the way that we practice and what might influence prior knowledge in terms of, say, novice learners in comparison to expert learners. And the way that cognitive load theory would help us understand that a little bit more in terms of sort of working memory and long-term memory, and how that then influences things like desirability of the challenge that you might come across in terms of your practice. So they sort of seem to to flow really nicely together and help us explain a position, as Jamie suggested, not the position, one position that maybe has been positioned quite traditionally in the past as being sort of down that continuum of isolated practice, and highlights that there's far more sort of variability and nuance to these particular concepts.
That's really interesting because you've used this word traditional. Is it a concern, and it's a question for either of you, is there a concern here that, things evolve, things change, new ideas come to the fore? Life has changed in as much as online now, people can post, whether it's on any social media platform, they can post creative, in inverted commas, creative ideas for coaching. And what I'm hearing you both say perhaps is that there's a concern that some of the approaches used 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago are being labeled as traditional and perhaps not as robust or as dynamic as maybe some new points of view, some alternative explanations. And you're saying kind of, hang on, wait a minute, let's just unpack some of these things that have been around for many years. And let's look at the nuance and complexity here. Actually, there is a place for these. Am I hearing you both correctly? A question for either of you.
Look, I think we're certainly not the first people to raise an issue about the use of the term traditional. For example, I think in the paper we cite John Dewey, who is writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, talking about the utility of referencing something as being traditional or the old school way of doing things. And the same issue has been raised by Lyle and Cushion in I think the reference off the top of my head is 2017, but I'm sure that they've written it before that. The question that I suppose that we're challenging is that if there is a singular traditional way of doing things, and that's the old school, then how old does something need to be before it becomes traditional? And how do we put a boundary on what's considered traditional, or that's the old way? And what we are saying is that the use of the term traditional versus novel or new or anything like that needs to be seen in relation to the body of literature that goes before it. And we're suggesting that there's a bit of a false dichotomy going on between what's considered traditional and contemporary. And like I said, we're not the first people to do that. And what we've used here is the idea that what we really want to be doing is looking at evidence-informed practice. And evidence-informed practice being that we're using the best available evidence, comparing that to the needs of the context and our professional judgment before making a decision about what's appropriate for this athlete, for this learner, here and now.
So turning to you, Robin, what I'm hearing Jamie say there is that we've got this whole raft as coaches. We've got this whole raft of methods that are linked to theories that we can turn to in any given situation. That there's not necessarily one way of doing something. It's about understanding context. It's understanding the people that you're coaching, the context that you're coaching in. And the exciting thing for coaches is, hey, there's a whole range of methods here. And if I look down the cognitive line of things, which is what we're going to unpack a little bit more today, actually there's been some stuff that's been used for many, many years that we can apply in our context with our people in this given situation. That feels like quite an exciting position to be in, rather than I'm just going to focus on this one way of doing it all the time, in all contexts, with all people. That's what I'm hearing, Robin.
Yeah, and I mean, we sort of highlight how we're taking sort of quite a pragmatic view about this in terms of where our starting point is when we're making these decisions. And we would suggest as practitioners that often we do, and we believe lots of other coaches do as well, start at what the problem is they want to solve in practice, or the particular learning aspect they want to focus on, and then make decisions about what is the most appropriate tool to use in response to that. Instead of maybe position ourselves with a bigger picture, as Jane referred to it, view, and then funneling down from that point to our practice design, we're just sort of looking at it from an angle of, okay, what is the problem in front of me? How do I want to solve that? And by having that range of tools that you refer to, it gives us more opportunity to decide what is the most optimal tool at any given time to help the learners explore or sort of manage that situation. So, for example, we often talk about, I suppose we design a lot of practice around the knowledge and needs of the performers at any given time. But there may be a particular skill within there that a particularly high performing athlete isn't particularly proficient at. And where we might adopt a sort of a more open, games based, lots of sort of contextual interference as they refer to it in practice, we might need to really reduce that noise and be more precise around a particular aspect that high performer isn't high performing at, if that makes sense. So therefore, we might go into different domains or different theoretical positions to pick a tool that would help us to explore that in an optimal way for that learner at that given time, depending on, as we refer in the paper, sort of their level of cognitive load that might be applied because of that particular aspect.
Before we unpack some of these concepts within cognitive psychology, I mean, Jamie, did you have anything further to add to what Robin said there, and from my summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think that the thing to highlight is we're not suggesting that any of the other perspectives that are out there are suggesting that there is a single way of doing things. That there is a difference between method and theoretical framing. What we're suggesting here is that the theoretical framing that coaches can use will necessarily also be different, and that will also inform different ways and different methods that people will understand practice. Now, look, as an example, cognitive load theory looks at individual ways, I suppose, how an individual might integrate existing knowledge, existing skill, against the load that an activity and instructional design confers on them. Basically, how much noise is going on my head when this coaching activity is going on. I'm probably not going to use that theory to understand social effects of learning, for example, role modeling or anything else. It's not the appropriate theory to reflect on or to use as a practical tool to shape the ways in which I might get this person to look at the psychological skills of this person over here and go, look, this is a really effective way of you progressing. Why don't you have a look at what they're doing? It's just probably not an optimal theory to use to reflect on that.
Interesting. Well, you've mentioned cognitive load theory. So in this paper, you do unpack several key concepts from cognitive psychology to highlight what cognitive psychology potentially has to offer the coaching community. You've mentioned, as I said, cognitive load theory there, Jamie, but why don't you, Robin, if you can unpack cognitive load theory a little bit more for us, bring this alive as best you possibly can. I can certainly think of some examples from the world of golf and golf coaching, but Robin, if you can talk to us a little bit about cognitive load theory, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, of course. So from a cognitive perspective, broadly learning is defined as sort of the change in long-term memory. So cognitive load theory allows us to consider both working memory and long-term memory, and sort of how we try and move from working memory and store this information into long-term memory. And clearly, therefore, there's an importance of prior knowledge, in this case, long-term memory. So what someone knows, perceives and understands prior to any particular learning activity or any instruction given to them will directly influence the way they learn that. So if we go into the sports domain, clearly high performing athletes that have maybe been playing, let's look at a soccer example, older, more players that have played a longer period of time in a particular club environment may have a much deeper level of longer term memory around the ways that their team do stuff, the sort of the ways they play the game, or specific individual skills within that. Newer players or more novice players coming into that environment may not have that same level of memory, and therefore, when you go into an environment or into a particular practice, there are different levels of sort of load, as Jamie referred to, that might be perceived by an individual because of that prior knowledge. So they can make sense of more things if they've got longer term memory, and they can therefore recognize and pick out what's going on and make sense of it in a much more efficient manner compared to someone who has far less long-term memory due to their level of learning or their sort of novice status within that environment. Therefore, they're trying to handle lots more information in there. They're not recognizing as much. So there's lots more new stuff going on there for them. And therefore, they can't necessarily take on that. So, for example, on average, an adult can sort of take on 7 bits of information, but probably only process 4 of those at a given time, to sort of highlight that if there's lots of things going on, there's therefore potential for them to become cognitively overloaded and therefore not be able to process what's going on around them.
That's really interesting. 7 bits of information. I'm thinking back to my degree in psychology, Atkinson and Schifrin. I believe we can hold about 7 bits of information, chunks of information in our mind. But this idea of making meaning around 4 bits, I mean, wow, that's quite important, I think, for a coach to know. And Jamie, coming to you, surely as a rugby coach, this is something that you need to consider in your session design and your coach behavior, your communication, your instruction, your feedback with relation to the session design as well. This is quite a dynamic notion of, I do have to bear in mind there's a bunch of individuals in front of me, my team's in front of me, and let alone personality differences, that by and large, they can take on 4 bits of meaningful chunks of information and nothing else by and large. That's kind of what I'm hearing here. This must mean something to you as a coach from session design and coach behavior perspective.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think as well that the let's say it's 7, it's 4, it's plus or minus 2. Those are nice heuristics, they're nice rules of thumb. We're certainly not suggesting that we can only do 4 things. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. But I think one of the classic ways I hear that coaches refer to this is is when a coach coaches the drill and not the skill. That you might formulate a really intricate learning activity for a group of athletes, but the list of instructions they need to fulfill this task get in the way of them actually learning. There are so many things going on in the way that a drill is designed that nobody actually learns anything. The same I've seen in games-based practice quite a lot is that there are so many different, dare I say, constraints or rules that are placed on a given activity that they all become background noise and meaningless because players can't actually focus, or athletes can't actually focus on what's going on in the activity. They're trying to remember the different ways in which they might score points, the different bibs they're supposed to target, the different things that are going on. And that is the essence of the application of cognitive load theory for a coach, is that you can't give people loads and loads of novel information if you want them to focus on what's important in an environment to help them learn.
You made me think as you were talking, I'm just going to briefly come back to you here, Jamie. You made me think of, say, using the computer games analogy or computer games process that's been done brilliantly by researchers and coaches like Amy Price, for example. So there's a really important place for this stuff, and of course you refer to games-based approaches, which we've unpacked with Dr. Stephen Harvey before and Dr. Shane Pill as well. These things are really important, but when we do them, it's recognizing that, hey, look, our brains, our working memory, our thinking space, if you like, only has so much capacity. And if learning is transferring that information into long-term memory, boy, we need to be careful. Yes, we want dynamic sessions, but sometimes there's too much information out there, Jamie.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm certainly, just to be absolutely clear, I am not in any way suggesting that games-based practice or any of the excellent work of the researchers that you've referenced is in any way a bad thing. It's a question of how much novel information is being provided to people and the importance of that, the novelty of that information. Are we getting people to focus on information in the environment that is useful for their learning or helps them get through and engage in the learning activity itself? So again, I coached last night, and we use a set of, they're not necessarily standard games, but we're probably changing 1 or 2 rules or 1 or 2 constraints per session, not going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right, go. Because we want the players at the club I coach at to be focused on important information to support learning rather than the rules of the game.
Coming to you, Robin, just dwelling on this idea of cognitive load theory and how much information, how much capacity people have to take on board information and make meaning. That's the key, isn't it, really, in many respects, to make meaning of this information. I mean, this must be something that, since you started writing this paper, and perhaps historically, that you've considered in your hockey coaching, that, like Jamie talking there about his session design, for hockey players, this is something that you must consider when you sit down and you write your session design, and perhaps you're constantly considering as you're delivering. Is that something that's going through your mind as you're delivering as a coach?
So that's certainly one of the great things about writing this paper. It certainly made me think more. I think probably going back to my early coaching days, I was very much around games-based approaches and probably didn't think enough about the specific learning activity that I was trying to achieve within that game, and trying to just sort of create games that allowed opportunities, but didn't necessarily hone in on that specific skill. And I think Shane Peel's podcast he did with yourself he referred to it sort of like cognitive dispersal, I think he said, in terms of, throwing so much at it that it becomes less sticky. But looks like there's lots going on, and there's a really interesting sort of, clearly games-based approaches, James said, are really, really valuable. But I think it's just made me hone more into what is the particular learning aspect that I'm interested in here, and how is the session I'm designing limiting or enhancing the opportunity for that information to be really precise, and really sort of have a high intent around that. That means that, in cognitive load terms, they refer to two types of load, or two of the types of load, in terms of intrinsic, which is a load that's imposed by the specific skill or the information needed to achieve a particular goal, and extraneous, which is any unnecessary load that creates sort of irrelevant noise around that learning goal. And I think from a practicing point, it's got me thinking about those particular types of load and how much of the extraneous load I want or is desirable enough to help the learner sort of challenge that learner to learn, and to pick up that skill, or to be able to execute that skill in any given situation.
I love that use of the term precision, and you're quite right to say that. I can't 100% remember what Dr. Shane Pill said. He had a wonderful term that was the opposite, basically, of cognitive dispersion. But precision kind of sums it up. Is that, if one thinks of attention being a strong currency of learning, as a coach, we probably want to help players hone their attention with precision onto the specific things that we want them to learn. And as a sports psychologist, and guys, there's not going to be a question here, but I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. I'm constantly thinking, from an overarching perspective, if I'm walking into an organization, a club, a team, etc., if my primary role is to help develop a mental skills program, then I have to be careful. I have to be careful of how much more load I'm placing on the resources of all the players, because I'm going to deliver more information here on top of the information that they're learning day to day. And also, when you said that brilliant word there, Robin, precision, I'm also thinking about, emotion, for example, during training. And there's evidence to say that can help learning. There's evidence to say it can hinder learning. But again, I'm thinking about the extraneous load that emotion can put on an individual or group of individuals as an activity unfolds, and how it can turn their attention away from the precise things that you want them to learn. Gents, no question, but any thoughts on what I've said would be welcome.
No, I think so. I suppose the first point, I was having a chat to a player that I used to coach a couple of days ago, and he was reflecting on how a new head coach had changed an environment, and that what that head coach had done was move things, had deliberately limited the cognitive load that players would be exposed to. Where at the training base, that was time for work, that was time for coaches are going to be catching up with you. But the volume of different coaches that might be coming at them would be a little bit less than there was before. And then when they were when they were outside the training base, that they wouldn't be getting that it was rest time. Now, and to the second point as well, I mean, I've done some work looking at the emotional disturbance that's created by various events in an athletic life. That negative emotion may well, and I saw an interesting tweet you put out the other day that I completely agreed with, that looked at the differential effects of if I've got a positive valence, if I feel good, then I'm likely to increase my confidence, my self-efficacy, my motivation. If I don't feel so good, then I might be reflecting in real detail about things. The problem being that if I reflect on the wrong things, or I reflect on things that are useless, well, that can also confer a really significant and unnecessary extraneous cognitive load because it doesn't help me. And I think all of those things are worth thinking about as a coach.
To round off cognitive load theory, I'm a huge fan of this. I mean, on the Sports Soap show, spoke to some depth on this with Doug and Marv, and it's an area I'm constantly interested in. A quick question for in terms of where those listening in can find out more. John Sweller being the main researcher here and writer of cognitive load theory. It's been used predominantly in education, but what I'm hearing you both say is well, you've unpacked it for me for the last 10 minutes. This is very relevant for a coach. Where would you direct people towards, other than your paper? Beyond that, where would you direct people towards to learn more about CLT, cognitive load theory?
Well, as you've mentioned, Dan, John Sweller would be a good starting point in terms of understanding. He does a number of very accessible blogs that give you a really good insight into that and allow you to explore the different sort of examples and how they might fit. And then, of course, there's some work around sort of, I think actually Mike Ashford's put it in one of his papers. There's some really good cognitive load effects sort of examples in a coaching context. I can't remember the specific paper. Jamie might have a better handle on that, but certainly there's some practical examples there that would help coaches to unpack a little bit more around what cognitive load theory might mean and help them to make sense of that in their environment. And for me, practically wise, I was thinking as yourself and Jamie were talking, one of those key things is just trying to understand how you manage that. And of course, this is going to flow into some of the other discussions around sort of desirable difficulties and that really trying to understand the level of prior knowledge that someone's coming in so that you can try and fish through what might be overloading a player. And we probably see examples of it in practice all the time. I think one of the examples I see, if you go into junior training environments, for example, like really young kids, and they'll be playing sort of 4v4, and you'll see a couple of kids that are really, focused on other aspects of the game. It might be that you want to work on passing, but because they've got their teammates, the opposition, they've got how they sort of get where they position the ball on the end of their stick in a hockey context, which foot they pass off. They've got so many things going on that it becomes harder and harder for them to focus on the quality of the way that they deliver that pass. So there's clearly lots of noise around this learning that's taking place in terms of the learning of passing. So it would, having read sort of around the cognitive load theory, it makes sense to think about, well, actually, hang on, let's strip this back. And that doesn't necessarily mean straight back to unopposed, no sort of contextual interference practice. It just says, how can we get rid of some of this noise? So, for example, go into a 2v1, which still has that back and forth notion of the game, still has a lot of representation in it, but just takes out, hang on, there's 4 defenders there. I've got 3 or 4 passing options. And I've got to think about all of that before I then try and deliver the execution of passing the ball. It goes, well, let's take out those. You've still got some interference around you, but you can focus a bit more on the passing of that ball.
Fascinating stuff. And you mentioned that term desirable difficulty, and I'm keen to unpack that. That's what you unpack in the paper next. We've spoken with Professor Nikki Hodges, for example, who spoke to difficulty. I suppose returning to this notion of tradition, perhaps sports can be a little bit guilty from a traditional standpoint of saying, well, learning happens through repetition, and actually what we know now is that obviously repetition and reinforcement is a big part of learning, but actually difficulty injecting difficulty into your sessions is something that's important because, well, for a number of reasons, not least because it forces players to strive to retrieve what they need to do, and that slows their thinking down, and actually that's learning taking place. I feel I've already answered here what desirable difficulties are just in that little segment, but I know that Jamie, you'll give us a more accurate explanation here. So desirable difficulties, let's talk a little bit about this.
And before I start, I'd say that the Keith Lose and Nicola Hodges paper is well worth a look for any coach. I think it's a really good example of translating research for coaches. For coaches, we reference it in the paper as well. So the concept of desirable difficulty is Robert Bjork's, and it refers to types of practice scheduling that make things desirably difficult. And there's a slight difference necessarily between desirable difficulty and the difficulty of practice, which I'm sure is really helpful to everybody who's being introduced to this for the first time. But desirable difficulty is practice scheduling. Is it random? Is it how often is it revisited? And what's the level of contextual interference that goes on between practice activities? So, for example, if I think about my own coaching group again, we are deliberately sequencing things over a period of time to help them learn over the long term. So what desirable difficulties might suggest is that you spend a period of time on something in a practice session. You get to the end of it and you go, "Oh, right, they're really good at it now. Right, they've learned it." When in reality, you're probably, again, looking at, I think it's Keith Lose, and my apologies if I get this wrong, he referred to that as skill adaptation, that we've adapted in the short term rather than actually learned a skill. Whereas what we're looking for is robust, sticky learning that we can see that is likely to occur as a result of optimally done through a desirable difficulty, which is differences in scheduling over an extended period of time rather than lots of blocked practice in one go. That is not, however, to suggest that blocked practice is a bad thing. That it may well be very useful for somebody to engage in a lower level of practice difficulty, and that's different necessarily to desirable difficulty, to help them understand and be able to gain competence at early stages of a skill. For example, using Robin's earlier example of a high performance player who is low performing at a particular skill, he or she might really benefit from some low variability, highly blocked practice to support their learning.
Robin, coming to you. Thanks so much, Jamie, for unpacking that. Coming to you, Robin, what does this mean to you, desirable difficulties? What does this mean to you in your coaching?
So I think firstly, there's definitely an acknowledgement of trying to find, and the challenge point framework is a really interesting one, about how do we position, what is a challenging or desirable difficulty in response to maybe what's an undesirable difficulty. So in a coaching context, I think it really challenges the idea of we've got to find that balance between what might be effortless and what might be over sort of loading in terms of challenging that particular environment. And how do we position our practice or behaviors as coaches to really support that? So Jamie talked about the sort of the scheduling of particular practice and skills and how you do that over a long period of time. There might also be the ways that we as coaches behave around a given sort of learning outcome. So the way that we respond in terms of feedback, how we give that feedback, when we give that feedback. And that even sort of maybe dips into some of the behaviorist principles around sort of like scheduling and the reinforcement of behavior through scheduling. Is it continuous, or are we down to sort of variable interval type scheduling where we are very much providing it, on average over a period of time, but not consistently. So it sort of makes the learner have to manage those potential challenges. But a novice learner, it may be that it is very consistent, continuous, and then it may go to a little bit more intermittent. So I think for me, it's, as a coach, it's understanding where the learner is, again coming back to that prior knowledge, and trying to position the level of difficulty effectively so that we can challenge them in an appropriate manner.
Coming back to you, Jamie, in your rugby coaching, I'd love to explore a specific desirable difficulty. If this is how this works, a specific desirable difficulty you might have injected into your session design in order to help players learn, essentially. How have you utilized a desirable difficulty or desirable difficulties in your own session design? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so basic level, we've over a period of months, we've been looking at where do players position themselves defensively, and the different spacings that they might manage between each other based on what's in front of them, how the opposition are playing. Now, what we could do is choose to spend 3 weeks. We're focused entirely on that. We'll tell them what to do, and we'll keep telling them what to do, and they will do it over and over and over again. Instead, the practice sequencing has used that and spaced that between other activities, that it becomes blended as part of everything else that, well, not everything else, but a range of other practice activities and a range of different foci for the player, so that rather than spending 2 sessions on it, it's blended into 3 or 4 months worth of training activity. And that is gradually made more difficult, but that's as an example of use of challenge point framework. But in terms of desirable difficulty, we're spacing it out, whether that's within a session or whether that's between sessions. We're using more or less coaching intervention, or more or less scaffolding, if you like, to support a player to be able to do it. And it's effectively seeing learning as a long-term activity rather than something that occurs in one session.
Interesting. Coming back to you, Robin, are there any experiences you've had in your session design that are sort of equivalent to what Jamie said there? I'm just trying to unpack this, or just help the audience really picture this in your hockey coaching. I mean, Jamie was speaking to distributed learning or spacing. My understanding also interleaving, reduced feedback, these kind of things are regarded as good, solid, desirable difficulties. What's your experience of utilizing this process?
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of, I suppose one of the really interesting environments for me is in the talent space, where we don't have regular access to participants. So it's not a weekly thing, or certainly in my past experience, the new system is a little bit more regular, but in previous years, it's been, once every 3 weeks, you might have a 2-hour evening session, and then a 6-hour block on a weekend, maybe once every 6 weeks. So it really challenges the way that you might try and level that desirability, because you've got a really long extended period of omission, almost, where they're not involved in your session. So how do you then bring in that desirability and try and really push that level of challenge? So certainly lots of, and that might be sort of considered over sessions in terms of lots of retrieval practice at the start of a session, in terms of, show me what you can do, show me what you do remember from the last session. So the first episode of a training session would be around that sort of show me, tell me, different types of questions, divergent, convergent, so that we are, I guess, checking prior knowledge, and also checking our own as coaches perception of an individual's prior knowledge and ability around a particular skill, because we've not seen them for 3 weeks, and we might remember them doing something well or not so well, and then make a decision on that. So I think it gets you thinking at a session level about the way that you design your practice to be able to, first of all, get a bit of information, do a bit of retrieval, a bit of check-in for understanding, and then go forwards into sort of, whether it's discovery-based learning, where you push the application of that skill a little bit further through the design of your session to really encourage the player to demonstrate that skill set.
I love how you've unpacked that, and it made me think. I mean, my my brain was whirring there as some of the conversations we've had in the past, just to make more meaning of this, more sense of this. I mean, you talked about starting a session with retrieval practice, which is a difficulty in and of itself, because it's, as you say, it's asking somebody to come back and answer some questions. And we talked to Dr. Shane Pill, as I've mentioned in this episode a few weeks ago, and he talked about starting his sessions. He's a very experienced coach with retrieval practice, and the use of divergent and convergent questions within that made me think of, we spoke about the spectrum of teaching styles with Shane. It also made me think about the conversation I had with Dr. Ed Cope and Professor Chris Cushion around Rosenshine's principles of instructions. I mean, Jamie, you talked about scaffolding as well. So all of this is interlinked, and there, what I loved as well, Robin, sort of at the beginning, that retrieval practice, I suppose, is more of a coach-led, coach-driven process at the beginning of a session, but then leading into discovery. So we become more player-led or player-driven, if those are the terms you want to use. So all of this seems to be thrown into the mix. Before we move on, no question, guys, I don't know if you wanted to make any further comments about this.
I think what Robin has just outlined is the essence of evidence-informed practice, where Robin is discussing a group that might meet for 2 hours every 3 weeks. I've got significantly more contact time with my group. And again, that has to be factored into the types of decisions or the levels of desirable difficulty that a coach makes. There is a clear contextual factor that's going to influence what a coach does. Because let's say Robin employs a very, very high level of contextual interference, but the players are only exposed to that once every 3 weeks. Well, that might then end up becoming a highly undesirable difficulty. And again, these are the types of factors that need to be taken into account when we're talking about the use of evidence in practice.
You speak there, Jamie, to contextual differences and participant differences. So the next section of your paper looks at expertise, novice differences. Robin, can you speak to this a little bit for us?
Yeah, certainly. So clearly, when we coach, we come across a range of athletes or performers or participants, depending whereabouts you're coaching, and there is a level of knowledge, understanding, and ability to execute. And by positioning or highlighting the sort of expert novice continuum per se, we're highlighting the need to consider what might characterize generally across those levels. And clearly there's a real challenge there, isn't there? Because lots of people listening will go, well, I coach a group, I might have 30 athletes on a pitch at one time. How do I therefore use this continuum to sort of position my learning at the right level? Because what one person is might be, one novice might look slightly different to another novice. So it's a way of just exploring the idea of what prior knowledge are people coming in with to your session? Is that characterized by their level on that continuum, as an example? Expertise, they've got lots of knowledge or perceived knowledge. They can recognize patterns of play a lot easier, and therefore they can respond to stimulus that's far more complicated. Whereas novices, they might need more time sort of, dissecting a particular aspect of that, or getting used to the idea of how a skill might be performed before then maybe inserting that back into or ramping that up through that desirability of difficulty by then adding layers of contextual interference. So for us, one of the main reasons why I think we wanted to present the expert novice conversation was, again, going back to the evidence-informed principles that Jamie referred to there. The learner in front of you and what characterizes them is surely, in our view, a key consideration of how you structure the learning that takes place. So it was a nod to that, to go, let's think about who's in front of us. But I think one of the caveats there is, and we refer to it towards the end of the paper, is it may not be, you've also got to think of it at a skill level. So you might have an expert performer, that's really good, but they might be a novice using their left foot, or in hockey terms, using their reverse stick. So therefore, then you've got to consider those sort of individualized differences within an individual, let alone across a group. So by no means, a sort of easy task, but again, a way of us trying to explain and explore how the learner in front of us influences the learning design.
Jamie, coming to you here, I know how you speak a lot about being evidence grounded, and maybe in my simplistic tones here, I think of being evidence grounded as, considering who, what, how, why in very basic terms. But it starts with the who, doesn't it? As Robin is saying, who am I coaching here? So that is going to make a difference to what we choose to do. Can you speak to this part of the paper a little bit?
I suppose in really simple terms, I mean, you earlier referenced my very fledgling jiu-jitsu career. We'll call it a career. It's nowhere near a career. But I have the privilege of training with some very high-level competitors who are competing at world level. And I am absolutely not anywhere near that level of performance. Now, I am a novice. And therefore, my ability to engage with and train with people who are at a level that is a galaxy beyond me is really difficult. They are setting me problems in training that I didn't even know existed. And therefore, my knowledge base, my skill base, means that I simply don't have the tools to be able to interact in a session with people of that level and benefit from it. I need a far simpler learning environment for me to benefit. So what am I learning from competing with people who are at a level than that, other than it is really difficult to breathe when I'm training with this person, and I've got 6 minutes to survive here. Now, by changing the nature of the problem, and I do get some very good coaching, by changing the nature of the problem, they make things simpler for me. And this is the interaction with cognitive load theory, is that I simply don't have the capacity, knowledge, capability, some people might say mental representations, to be able to solve really difficult problems. So I need simpler problems in order to learn.
My mind is a whir here, because I'm going to return to my first sport of golf. We're recording today at a time we've just had a weekend of golf on TV. It was the Masters. And I found myself sitting there listening to the commentary, and I'm really not speaking to learning here, although it is about learning the game. I was listening to the commentary, there's usually brilliant commentary when it comes to golf. There's good punditry. And a lot of the terms used are very golf specific, requires a lot of knowledge to understand some of the things the commentators say, whether it's about the ball breaking or whether it's the club bouncing. At one point they said, oh no, that bounced there. No, the ball didn't bounce, it was the club head bouncing on the sand. You need to really know golf to understand that. And so what, as you're both speaking, it makes me think actually there's an engagement piece here as well, which is a forerunner to learning, perhaps, is that the language I use matters, and we come back to that notion of who are my people and what do they know. So there's that relationship there between expertise and cognitive load theory as well. So no question, but to round this part off, knowing who's in front of you and knowing what they know, and considering language, instruction and knowledge, it's so imperative, isn't it, for coaches to consider this: who is in front of me, and that is going to drive my coach behavior.
I'd completely agree. I'd also say it's and this is where the translation of theory becomes important and interesting. It's also knowing what they can do as well as what they can know, because I can hear the shouts of lots of coaches going, well, players can tell me what they're aiming to do, but they can't do it. And we've got to take that into account. And I think that's the discussion about retrieval practice and how you apply the different theories we're talking about here from an educational domain, because that question could be a design of a learning activity. Right, let's just check, can they do this as a check for learning, if you like.
Robin, any last thoughts on that little section?
Yeah, I think your golf example really struck to mind, and we refer to a couple of models of motor learning in that area around the novice expertise differences. And you've sort of got Gentile's model. I think hopefully I've pronounced that right, in terms of the two stages, getting the idea of the movement. And you referred to sort of almost the regulatory conditions, the shape of the ball, the shape of the club. But then understanding those non-regulatory conditions in terms of, it's windy, or I'm hitting off this particular surface at this particular angle. And all of that will be part of that novice development, in terms of you might have to really break that down and have that, through either coach behaviors in terms of explaining and exploring, or your sort of session design. alongside understanding that the development of a basic movement pattern, which links into Jamie's idea of they can talk me through it, but they can't do it. And that would all very much be seen as being in that sort of novice stage of development, which clearly would have, more useful pedagogical tools to help achieve, versus going down that sort of, fixation end of Gentile's model, where it's about refinement of movement pattern, and therefore, they're going through the full repertoire, or in a more open game, this ability to diversify and adapt that skill to the changing context that they're in. So using those models, I think, for coaching practices helps us think about, well, what is a learner and what are the information they do or don't have, as Jamie suggested. Do they can tell me about this, but if they can't do it, is that because they don't have a basic movement pattern? And if so, what can I do to help them develop a basic movement pattern before then moving them into a more diverse, contextually relevant environment?
Well, I could talk about that all day long, but I want to be conscious and respectful of your time. So let's move on to the final concept that you unpacked. We'll come back to you straight away, Robin, and that's fidelity, which is quite a hot potato in coaching. Can you talk to us a little bit about fidelity when referenced under cognitive psychology?
I mean, I'll give you my little bit, but certainly Jamie will speak far more sense around this than I can. But ultimately, it's this acknowledgement that there are different types of fidelity, and that these types of fidelity are useful for coaches to consider when designing practice and thinking about the type of fidelity they may sort of emphasize in any given practice. So we've got sort of like, practice fidelity in terms of representative of the game or the particular environment. Physical fidelity. So are we looking at the particular physical demands of any given moment of a game? So for example, in my sport, if we're looking at carrying the ball and we're thinking about carrying over distance, then clearly that requires some physical skills that we might really ramp up at any given time to emphasize those as a key development of that particular activity. So, in terms of running at pace, body position and things like that. Psychological fidelity in terms of the sort of mental demands of any given opportunity. And that could be used to sort of emphasize and understand where we might sort of, scale up or scale down particular representation in practice, because actually it's about we're trying to develop focus control. Therefore, if we want to develop focus control as an important thing, we might ramp up the psychological fidelity and maybe de-emphasize some of the other aspects, such as the practice fidelity, as an example. And then conceptual, in terms of fidelity, in terms of the scenario makes sense to the person that is receiving that opportunity. So the guidance we give in the paper is around providing the minimum level necessary of fidelity based on the participant needs, going back to cognitive load theory, in order to try and reduce any extraneous cognitive load, so that we're looking at, emphasizing different types of fidelity. So again, I think in a coaching toolbox, it opens up more considerations about why am I doing that practice? What am I focusing on in that practice? And how is it helping to develop that athlete, knowing what I know about them at any given time? So going back to that question at the start about my sort of mental skills in hockey, perhaps I might have needed a little bit of, guidance from coaches that ramped up some psychological fidelity around certain things to help me develop skill sets to manage a decision goes against you in a game, and how do I deal with that sort of stuff? So emphasizing that as the learning outcome over some of the other bits would change the way that you put together your session. But I'll stop there because Jamie will be able to add far more detail to that.
No, look, I think that the key bit to emphasize here is that no matter what position you're coming from, no matter what meta-theoretical framework we started with at the start, is that the more representative, the higher fidelity of practice that you are subject to, the more likely you are to transfer into ultimate performance. But the key bit there is transfer, not necessarily learn. So therefore, if Robin referenced different types of fidelity, and I think that it's important to state that when we're talking about types of fidelity, we're not necessarily enforcing an artificial dichotomy of the world where if I perceive high pressure, that's different from the ways in which I might move. It's more of a thinking tool for coaches to go. what elements of the challenge am I dialing up or dialing down in this practice? So if it's psychological fidelity, in different bodies of literature would see that as the type of pressure that I'm feeling. If I'm preparing for an Olympic final or a Paralympic final, then I'm going to be experiencing a significant amount of performance pressure. Now, that type of performance pressure is incredibly difficult to generate in a training scenario. And therefore, that's going to influence the ways in which we practice. It's also going to influence the ways in which we design sessions over the long term to support somebody to transfer into that level of pressure. It's also why we see lots of different debates about the value of unopposed practice, because unopposed practice is very low in terms of fidelity across lots of areas. But, however, that may well be very useful to somebody depending on their current level. It's just not going to help somebody transfer it into the real game, into the real world. There's a number of different steps that need to take place beforehand.
Really interesting, really interesting. And what I love about this paper is that you unpack these important concepts: cognitive load theory, desirable difficulties, level of expertise, and fidelity. And then you provide a long section on implications for practice. And we've kind of unpacked the implications as we've gone along here. So we've covered a lot of the implications. But to conclude things, I'd love to get some final thoughts, perhaps on those implications, or whatever final thoughts you'd both like to share. Perhaps, Robin, if we come to you first, is there anything you'd like to share with the Sports Psych Show audience around implications, or anything to do with the four concepts that we've spoken about?
Yeah, of course. I think, and it's really sort of unpacked again, having this conversation with both of you around what's really important. And I think for coaching practice, our consideration of how we assess prior knowledge is a really interesting one to think going forwards about, what are we doing and how are we doing that in order to have a solid foundation to help us apply or consider the concepts that we've talked about in the paper, in terms of, how do we know what is overloading? How do we know what is desirable? How do we know what's appropriate level of fidelity? How do we know what level the learner is at this given point in time? So some consideration around practicalities of prior knowledge assessment for me is a really interesting one in terms of how we do that in practice. And I think Jamie alluded to the idea of it depends on the context, doesn't it? It depends how much time we have with the athletes. It depends on what else they're doing around that. It also depends on us as practitioners about our skill sets to be able to, design practices that allow us to see the prior knowledge as clearly as possible. So again, if we put too much noise around that, does that hinder the coach's ability to assess prior knowledge of a given learning task? Or actually, is that appropriate enough at the level that we're looking at to do that? How do we use questioning to check understanding, but also triangulate that with our ability to observe skills in practice and understand, whether or not an athlete is demonstrating a significant level of prior knowledge or understanding what their prior knowledge is. So setting up appropriate practice that encourages that and allows a coach to do that, I think, is a really interesting one to grapple with. I certainly don't think it's straightforward, but something for thought around when they come into our sessions. What are we doing as coaches? Or what are our processes around that? Jamie talked about the environment he's in with all of the component parts that allow him to probably check prior knowledge in lots of different spaces, whether that's on pitch, off pitch, hot and cold type environments. Whereas in the hockey example for me, we get very limited time or very sort of dispersed opportunities to check that. So that changes the way that we do that. And every coach listening would have a similar context to unpack in order to identify that. So for me, number one, I think, is that, valid assessment of prior knowledge as we refer to it in the paper.
Really interesting. And I almost to speak to your first point, I love these kind of papers that where we can have a conversation, reflect upon these concepts in this case, and have a more sophisticated conversation around these. It really gets you thinking, doesn't it? It really gets you questioning what you're doing. Jamie, coming to you, your thoughts on our conversation today, and any takeaways you'd like the audience to leave us with.
Yeah, so I hope what we've been able to outline today is that we're certainly not saying that, for example, that cognitive psychology is the only way in which coaches should look at their practice. We've alluded to a few other different theoretical frameworks that coaches might use. However, much like we're pointing out with evidence-informed practice, we've got to look at what's the best available evidence and, I suppose, best available theory based on the needs of the individual, the needs of the context, and the ways in which we can make sense of our practice. And that's the essence of the paper, is that we're using using individual theories from cognitive psychology, which by absolutely no means outline the entirety of the coaching process. They give us a window into different elements of it. And we've just got to be really careful with the ways in which we apply theoretical frameworks, research theories, and how we use them in the real world, because theory is not reality. And we've just got to make sure that, and this is a coaching thing as well, is that we've just got to be able to understand what's the place of theory in practice, and be able to use lots of different stances to critically reflect on and shape our practice, especially since there are a variety of novel and new ways of theoretical framings. For example, we've referenced active inference in this paper and predictive processing. Now, whilst those theories are really interesting and will probably offer significant implications, I don't think that in 10 years' time we're going to be sat here saying, right, we've got an entirely new way of coaching. But they may well offer us different ways to reflect on and think about the methods that we use.
Interesting. Robin, Jamie, thank you so much for this conversation. It's got me thinking, reflecting on what I do every day, even as a sports psychologist. How can people find you, follow you, get in touch if you'd like them to, and also how can they find this paper? It is open access. Jamie, let's come to you first.
So people are welcome to email me, either jamie.taylor@dcu.ie or jamie@greymattersuk.com. My Twitter handle, I think, is @JTGreyMattersUK, but I'm sure you can pop that up, and I'm very happy to answer any and all questions.
And Robin?
Yeah, so email via robin.taylor@dcu.ie or via Twitter. My Twitter handle is rdtaylor_16.
All right. Gents, thanks so much for today.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about the Sports Psych Show. So if you've got any suggestions, please do get in contact via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show, and I'd be delighted to hear those suggestions. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.